I'm not sure if it recorded because...
It should go red when it records.
Yeah, but his laptop stopped, so maybe the video signal was gone, so maybe that's why. Let's see the audio is... Hello. Hello. So your session is until the coffee break, right?
Ja.
Die sessie is tot aan de coffee break?
Ja, volgens mij wel.
Oké.
Start here. There's the open source Drupal training. Oh, no.
Yeah, so the open source Drupal training session will be at 4:20 this afternoon, and this session will be from 10 to 11. So in case you want to check out Sketch for designers and developers and you have an issue.
Moet ik hier naar de zetten?
Ja.
Oh, oké.
Iemand USB-C naar agenda?
Ja, super. Wil je dit spelen deelnemen? Ja.
Dat deed je toch?
Wel, maar ik zie dat zo. Ja, dat is
Oh, okay,
Yeah, so for your information, this session will be from 10 to 11, and the session that was planned in the schedule, open source Drupal training, will be this afternoon at 4:20. So you know.
Or actually, I'm gonna make it to 11.
Oh,
More like 10:15.
Should be on. I'll double check.
Okay, yeah. Okay, 10 o'clock. Let's just get going. Maybe some people will come in. After all, we did have a couple of beers last night, so okay, so let's go. Welcome to the Mythmaster Migraines and Migrations. Who has practiced pronouncing the title, because that's required to be in the session. Excellent, good to see that. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about migrations today. Good to have you all here. If something's not clear, I mean, we have room for questions at the end, but if something's not clear, just feel free to raise your hand and ask immediately, because I think that's the best way to learn and keep track of what I'm going to tell you. So, my name is Marc van Gent. I am a Drupal developer for about 11 years now, working at Limon Groen, and yeah, so that's how I came into contact with migrations. I do like pretty much everything from front end to back end, and we have some interesting clients with a couple of projects that needed migrations. So that's how I gained some experience and thought, well, this is something I have to share with all of you, so here I am. But definitely, let's talk about you. Who considers themselves developers here? Okay. Any project managers in the room? Okay, cool. Anyone who is like the side owner, or you call the client? Okay. None of the above? Tell me.
Researcher.
Researcher, okay, cool. So, let's see, what do you think the key to a successful migration is? Is that good, clean source data? Or is that a committed cooperating client? Or is it just plenty of development time? Who's for A? Yeah, yeah, don't shy. I see a couple of A's, yeah. Any B's? Yeah. Well, I see what you're doing there. Any C's? Right, yeah. Eeks knows what I'm doing here. Everybody was right. I mean, we all need all these things. It's not just one thing. A good migration is a combination of lots of factors. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. This is not a talk just about code. This is not a talk just about the human side of things or project management. We need it all. Cool. So, just to have a bit of focus, I'm going to talk about non-Drupal to Drupal migrations. Why? Well, mainly because that's what I have most experience with. We don't see a lot of clients coming from older Drupal sites needing to migrate to newer Drupal sites, but we often have clients that come from another CMS or no CMS at all and just have a bunch of data lying around, and we need to process it and incorporate it into the new site. So, non-Drupal to Drupal migrations. I'm going to talk about the source, process, destination workflow. Hi, welcome. So, source, process, destination. I'm going to talk about how you set up your site and a custom module to be able to do something like that. See how a really simple migration would work and what code you need to get it going. I'm going to talk a bit about source data. I'm going to talk about processing plugins. I'm going to talk about how this all comes together in the context of a project, and if we have time, we'll end with a couple of tips. So here's the first myth. Migrations are complicated. Yeah. So, because it's pretty straightforward, literally. You got a source, you process it, there's a destination. It's a linear process, and yeah, it's not that hard once you know the basics. So, source, process, destination, what does it actually mean? So, the source can be pretty much anything. In my examples, I'm going to start off assuming we have a database, a MySQL database with some data, but it can be a file like CSV or XML or JSON, whatever. It can be a URL, it can be an API, whatever, just returns data. We want it to provide one result for each migration item. In other words, it needs to yield some lines that, okay, so this is number one, here's a thing, here's number two, another thing. And we wanted to define a unique source ID. So this is what it looks like. We got a bunch of data and we want it to have 1, 2, 3 for one item. For each item that we want to import, it's got a unique ID and it's listed here. So then the next step is processing. Processing is about mapping values in the source to entity, fields, properties. But it's sometimes also about transforming the data. Sometimes you want stuff to be uppercase or lowercase, or you need stuff to be completed because some value is missing and you want to insert the default value if the value is missing. Or sometimes you want to connect it to another migration, a migration lookup. We'll get to that later. Some custom transformation, there's a lot of it is possible. What's nice about the process tabs is that process plugins, which we'll see later, are chainable. You can perform one processing step after the other until your data is ready, and it's more, well, the items are more rounded and complete, ready to become actual Drupal items. And that's the last step, that's the destination. We want to decide if it's going to be a node or a term or a redirect or a setting or anything that's an entity can be really easily created in the Drupal Migrate API. So the data you got collected is written to the Drupal database. The great thing about Migrate API is that it can support rollback. So you can say, okay, so this didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, so roll back, change your code, do it again. And one of the really important things is that it creates a mapping from the original source ID to the destination ID. So you'll always have this table telling you, okay, so what was number 1 in our source has now got ID 40 in our destination, in our final Drupal site. Right, so here's a must. We need the right tools. Pretty obvious, I guess. Move over here. Might be a bit easier. I'm in front of the screen all the time. Right, so modules. We got migrating core. Hi, welcome. And it provides a migrate API and some base functionality related to the source destination, source process destination flow I was referring to. It supports continuous migration with ID mapping. So continuous migration, that means that you can run a migration over and over again, and when there's something new available in the source database, it will be added to the stuff that was already imported. That's a good thing, because it means that the source destination, the source of your data can evolve over time. I mean, if it's a site that is still live, stuff can still be added to it. So that means that you can start and keep working on your migration, and they will evolve together until you're ready to move to the new site. I'm also using Migrate Plus. So Migrate Plus allows you to define migrations as config entities. It's just an easy way to configure your migrations and make them available in the system and run them. It also offers some additional plugins and enhancements. It offers data parsers and authentication plugins. So stuff to parse CSV or XML, or being able to retrieve your data from something that has basic HTTP auth on it. And the Migrate Plus module also contains a lot of examples. So if you're stuck and you think, how should this work? What would my config look like? You can look at the examples. It's really useful. And then finally, there's a Migrate Tools module, which provides some drush commands and a UI. So you can run it from within the Drupal admin UI. You can execute your migrations. Okay, some more tools. Drush. I guess we all use it. It's really useful to be able to import migration config, to run migrations, and do other things like roll back, reset status. And Drupal console is a great tool to spit out some boilerplate for plugins, like processing plugins. We'll see that a bit later. And then finally, if you're working with database as source, you're probably going to need a database manager. I like the one that's built into PHP Storm. You can also use PHP MyAdmin or whatever it is you like. So yeah, you would, in any way, you need some kind of knowledge about the source and the structure that you're dealing with in order to take out all the data that you need. Right, so if I'm going to write a custom module, it would probably look a bit like this. This is the custom module that I made to start off a migration, custom migration. So it's got an info YAML, obviously. It's got a config install directory, and in this directory we got our configuration. So you see two types of configuration here. We've got a migration demo node article, which is something that imports articles, and it's got a migration group. We'll get to that later, but this is all you need in terms of configuration. And then you see I've got in the source plugin migrate directory two plugins. The process plugin is not needed, but this is like an example of what it would look like, which would contain in this case a title cleanup processing plugin, just something that cleans up my titles, and a source plugin, and that's what actually accesses the database and returns the rows. So that contains a query to select the stuff that I need from the source database. So in the next slides I'm going to be looking at a fictional example. So let's say we've got a source database which contains music data, artists and albums. And we've got a Drupal site containing two node types, an artist with just the title, really simple node type, and then an album which has now a title, a relation to the artist, a release date and a URL. So let's see what it would look like. My first migration. First we're going to create a migrate group. Migrations are grouped in migrate groups, so we need at least one. Then we're going to look at what the migration looks like and then how to run it. So this was a bit of a well, a surprise to me when I started this the first time. I was like, okay, so I need a config entity. I know config entities are stored in YAML. Where do I get the YAML? Oh wait, I got to write it myself. It was new. It's not difficult. I mean, YAML looks a bit like this, you know. So it's a readable format. It's understandable. It's hard to make like really terrible mistakes, and the syntax is pretty clear. But yeah, you have to write it by hand, which is okay. You can do it. So, migration groups. They group migrations, and why it's useful? Well, it allows you to keep a bit of structure in your backend. It also allows you to import all migrations in a single group at one time if you have multiple groups. And migration groups have shared configuration. And the shared configuration is, for instance, interesting if you have like this source database, and well, obviously all the migrations in this group are using the same source database. In your backend, it would look a bit like this. Once you have the modules installed that I mentioned, you'll see a list of the migration groups, and when you click the list migrations, you will see the migrations that are under it. It's nothing complicated, really. And this is what the YAML would look like in the Migrate demo module. It's got an ID, it's got a label, a description, source type, and here this is the one, shared configuration source key migrate. So what this really means, we're going to see in the next slide, but pay attention to this line. And then it's got a dependency on the migrate demo module. Don't feel the need to memorize this all, because this is also in the example files of the Migrate Plus module. So, in your settings PHP, you know that there's the definition of your database connection. And it also, usually it says databases default. And we hardly use anything else, but this is the time that you're actually going to use this capability of Drupal to define multiple database connections. So here we say database is migrate default, and here the migrate key in this first line, that relates to the migrate to the migrate key we saw here. So this tells your migration, okay, we're going to use this database connection to pull our data from. Well, and the rest is, I guess, pretty much well known to most of you who ever looked at settings PHP. So now let's look at this source. So we have our database connection. We have a group that defines that everything within this group uses this database connection. So now we're going to create a source plugin. In PHP, we need a class which extends source plugin base. How do we get it? Well, you can use Drupal console. Drupal generate plugin migrate source will get you some boilerplate code in your module in the right directory with namespaces and everything. So that's a pretty easy way. Version 9 doesn't do this, or at least last time I checked, doesn't do this, but that's okay. We've got Drupal console. So what does it look like? I cut it up in a couple of pieces so we can step through it and see what the code looks like. We've got an annotation, and it defines the ID of this source plugin. And as you can see, it extends the SQL base, which is a source plugin base class with some defaults and basic implementations of methods. So we are overriding the query method. This is important because this is where your query is defined. So what should I get from this database in order to return those rows, those numbered rows. So here we're selecting from the artist table two fields, the artist ID and the name. That's it. Pretty simple. And here we've got the fields. This just provides Migrate with some information about, okay, so which fields do I have available, and it, for instance, it allows other modules to see if there are fields in your source that have not been mapped to destination properties, for instance. Just like an info method. It doesn't really do anything. The get IDs method is pretty important because this defines where the migration gets those unique IDs from. In this case, we have only one unique ID, but it can be an array of multiple values. So in this case, we say, okay, so in this source destination, the artist ID field is what defines our source ID. If you have multiple IDs, then it will be a combination of those two IDs, and the combination has to be unique. In this case, just the artist ID has to be unique. And so why is this important? Well, it allows Drupal to see which items have been imported already in the mapping table and which artist IDs would be new if there would be additions to the source database. You can see, okay, so what's new, what haven't I imported yet, and what needs to be migrated. So that's the whole definition of our source. So Drupal knows now where to get our data from. Now we're going to create migration config to tell Drupal, okay, so how are we going to take this data and put it into Drupal entities? So this is what a migration config looks like. It's got an ID and a label. It's got a migration group. So we created a group before, so here we're specifying which group it belongs to. We're specifying the source, so that's the source plugin we just wrote. And here we have like a couple of processors. Process, the most basic thing that process step needs to do is the mapping. Mapping is just one of our processes. So this just says, okay, so the title of our node, of our entity, needs to come from the name property on our source record. And as you'll know, a node has a type as well. The type of our node is not in the source database because the source database never knew it was going to be imported into Drupal entities, right? So that's why we use the default value plugin. Just saying, okay, if we need a type, plug in a default value artist. So now, when it goes to our destination plugin, the entity node, which tells Drupal, okay, this needs to be saved as an entity. Now Drupal knows, okay, so I take the title from the name field and the type has to be artist. So an artist node is created. This is all all the configuration you need for Drupal to connect the source to its destination. So now we still need to import it. Once a module has been installed, so our custom module that contains this migration has been installed, only the first time you install it, config is imported. So that's a bit of a strange thing here. We need, if we developing this, working on our migration config, we need to import this config over and over again. Fortunately, it's really easy with Drush. Drush config import, partial source, means that import all the config YAML files from our own config install directory from a module. So once you do this, once you change your config in the module, I run this command, so that's when Drupal gets aware of your changes that you just developed. And then it's just a matter of running the import, Drush migrate import, and then you specify the ID of your migration. Or what you can also do is specify the name of a group, and then it will run everything inside the group. Or you can use the UI. So here we have a list of our migrations, and there's an execute button, and you can click it and you can run it. Any questions so far? Okay. How are we doing for time, by the way? Let's see.
25 past now.
Okay. Cool. Right. So now we know this like really basic migration. Let's look at source data, because this is where things can get a bit interesting. Let's say messy sometimes. Because here's the myth. Who's ever seen a client said, okay, yeah, no, our data is complete, it's good, clean data. Yeah, I see some nodding. Yeah, okay. This is where your migraines come in. No, believe me, it's not. It never is. And that's okay, I mean, they can't help it, but keep it in mind and be prepared to deal with this. When you're starting your first talk with your client, or with maybe it's another department in your company or whatever, where the data is coming from, there are a couple of things you want to discuss. First thing is, how can we access the data? Do we get direct access to a database? Usually, they're not too keen on that. Or do you get an export? Or do they have an API perhaps where you can like continuously query the live data? You really have to check, because when, for instance, exports are involved, it means you also have to make sure, okay, so when do we get the export? How do we get it? Is it going to be 1 megabyte or is it going to be 5 gigabytes? Because that's the difference. and also if it's a source that is still being enhanced and that still expands, then you have to check with them how often are we getting a new database. So yeah, that's this. How do we get the updates? How often? Are they full new exports, or do we get incremental exports? Do things have timestamps? That would be great as well. You know, if you can use timestamps and see what data has been updated and what has not, that can be helpful in order to work efficiently. And don't forget to ask about assets like PDFs and images, because they're not in the database usually. In fact, if they are in the database, your problem is probably even bigger. But yeah, make sure to think about this as well. And yeah, if they say, oh, we'll just FTP it to some location, ask how big it is, because yeah, that can be some kind of bottleneck. So yeah, ask the people what kind of sizes are we talking about. This is about numbers of items, but also gigabytes, number of files. Get a grip on what you're looking at, roughly. And this is not just about, not just because it can be a problem, but also because sometimes if they say, okay, we've got like 20,000 articles and they need to be imported, and 4 of these articles have a PDF attached. Well, in that case, don't bother writing a migration for 4 PDFs. We'll just handle it manually. So you need to have a bit of feel for these numbers. And finally, make some friends at the supplier side. You need those people, and even if you're going to be annoyed and yeah, sometimes it can be a bit of a fight. Still, make sure you're friends with them, because if you're not, then they're going to give you a hard time. So once you get the data, it's time to analyze it. And seriously, ask the most stupid questions you can think of. Do not make assumptions, because assumptions are the mother of all fuck-ups, as we know. Ask them, what does it all mean? If you see articles, if you see news articles, if you see products in that database or in files that you're getting, don't assume that you know what an article is, because it might turn out to be slightly different than what you thought it was. Ask them about IDs, because IDs are important. Does everything have a unique, unchanging ID? Do users have email addresses? Do all articles have titles? Seriously, I run into this, assuming, well, I mean, come on, it's an article. We were importing like 60,000 articles from a magazine, and they had a whole archive on digitized. Surely every article must have a title. No, at least not in the database. Ask them if records are being added and deleted. And if the question is yes, are unique IDs reused? That can be an interesting complication. Does the data contain duplicates? And perhaps they will say no, and then ask them, really, did you check? Or, you know, sometimes people aren't even aware how bad or how dirty their data is, and that's understandable, but yeah, you need to check, because that's where a lot of time can go in if you need to fix things like that. So do not assume that people know their own data. So even if you asked all those questions, go in and check and try to see if you can actually make sense of everything that's been delivered. And then start planning. Sometimes you just need to make choices, and in the ideal world, you're having a Scrum Agile process, and you can do this together with your client. Don't spend 4 hours automating something that takes 8 hours manually. And this may sound like a contradiction because, hey, 4 hours is less than 8, but yeah, it's never going to be 4, right? Agree what you're doing and agree what you're not be doing. Like those 4 PDFs I just mentioned, just make it very clear that, okay, let's make this something for the editors to do once the site is online. Let's not bother with it and make it clear. Those people are paying for your hours, and they're probably also like to not pay for hours that are not necessarily to be spent. Have the result tested. Test if the content is what you expect, but also test functionally. Are links between elements correct? How about URLs and URL redirects? All those things, make sure that it all comes together the way you expect. And write a plan for the go live. This might include the content freeze because, at some point, especially if you're working with database experts or other kinds of experts, once this final expert has been made, everything that will be added to the source database from that point on will not be included in your new site. Sometimes that's okay, and they will just keep track and make sure it's entered in both places. But sometimes it's more easy to say, okay, well, create a content freeze and say, okay, we stop here, no more new articles from this point on, no more commenting on the old site. We take 24 hours to completely do the migration and get the new site live, and then from that point we'll get new content. Something like that. Pick dates, instruct editors, make sure that the editors know what to do. Sometimes editors need to have a look at the data and make some manual adjustments on your staging server before it goes live. Well, make sure that they know when to use the staging server and when things are being moved to the production server, of course. Well, this is not something specific to migrations, but it is more common to see that it's really important to agree on all those dates and make sure that everyone's on the same page if you're working with migrations. So here's a myth. Migrations are simple. And yeah, I know. I said migrations are straightforward. But when you get really into the details and you've seen the data that may be a bit off, a bit incomplete, a bit strange, a bit duplicated, a bit, all kinds of things that you come across in your new data, that's where the complexity starts to happen. And so prepare to write custom processes, because they are your most important tool to get this source data in the shape that you want it to be. Processes are awesome, actually. This is the default process plugin. It's the get plugin. So, like I said, the most basic thing that the processing step does is mapping. So this just says, for my title value, get the name value from our source record. It can be even written shorter. There's a shorthand notation. This is exactly the same. It's just even less YAML. Process title name. So if you don't specify which processing plugin you need, it assumes that you'll have you'll use the get processing plugin. So this is the minimal required process configuration. If you don't have this, the name property in your source will not be migrated, and your title will remain empty, which is a problem. Although Migrate does allow it, it will just save a node without a title for you, and then when you're going into the edit form, you will notice that you can't save it because you get a form validation error. Cool. So what's cool about processes as well is that you can have configuration. So you can make processes that are a bit more flexible because you can use the same process for over and over again and provide it with configuration. So the default value process plugin is an example of this. We saw this example earlier. For the type, we are using the default value plugin, and then default value, this key default value album, that is configuration. So once this processor is running, it will take this configuration value and use it to do whatever it's programmed to do. And in the plugin, there will be a line like this configuration default value, and it will return album in this case. So when you're writing your own processors, you can just call this configuration in your processing plugin class to get everything that was defined in the YAML file. Something else that is really important is that you can link migrations together, because we are going into larger databases, like the example I was telling about. You have artists and you have albums, but albums were made by artists. So there's a reference from the album entity to the artist entity. The Migrate API has dependency support built in, so it will make sure that the artist migration is run before the album migration is run. And in that way, it can make sure that the artists are already available when the albums are imported. And then that's where the migration lookup process plugin comes in. And this is how you configure it. It says field artist, so this is our destination. What needs to go in field artist? Well, use the migration lookup plugin. We refer to this other migration where the artists were imported, and we say the source is the artist ID. So this means that get the ID of the entity which was created when demo node artist imported this artist ID. That's basically in human language what this says. So again, you see here why it's really important to have unique IDs in your source database and to create your process plugin in a way that it provides these unique IDs, because that's how the album from the original database, from the source database, can refer to an artist ID that was also in the source database, and all the mappings in your Drupal database will make sure that in the new database it's also glued together in the right way. And of course, for this to work, we need field artist to be an entity reference field, but I guess that's pretty logical to set it up like that. So this works with references between nodes, but this also works with, for instance, authors of nodes. If you have like a list of authors in your source database, then you can import them like this to be the authors of the new nodes in your Drupal database. So, like I mentioned earlier, processing plugins can be chained. So that means that only the first plugin we see here has a source property. So we say, okay, so take the author ID from our source database, sorry, our source row, and run it through the author deduplicate processing plugin. This is actually taken from one of our projects. We had a lot of authors in this source database, and sometimes with different spellings. And they didn't have unique IDs, they were just names. And sometimes for one single person there were 5 different ways in which their name was spelled. So instead of like programming our own fuzzy logic to make sense of it all, our client just went through the whole database and told us, okay, so this is a duplicate of that, and that, and then out came a whole mapping, a table of duplicates, and that's allowed us to write them off the deduplicate plugin. So when the chaining, when you have multiple plugins, process plugins defined, chaining will make sure that once that this first plugin has done its magic, it will return a value, and that value is then passed on to the next plugin. So now, first, once it's deduplicated, it will go to the migration lookup and make a connection to the user's migration and link it to the user entity that was created. And if this did not return a valid value, then we're going to the default value plugin saying, okay, so if we didn't find anyone, use user ID 44. So that's how chaining works. Now, when you want to create your own processing plugin, that will require a class, again, extending process plugin base. You can use Drupal console for this, and you can also use Drush 9. So just whatever works best for you. And so this will create some boilerplate codes so you can start with your own processing plugin. So here's an idea for a custom processor for this fictional site I was talking about. You could do lots of things, like connecting to a Spotify API and enriching your source data with a release date and a URL. So what would it look like? Let's go through this file step by step. First, it contains an annotation. So we have an ID for this processing plugin. So this Spotify info is what is eventually used in your YAML. This is the most important method in such a file, in a class, a processing class. It's a transform method. So it gets a value, and this value is the thing that is taken from the source database. And so this value is the thing that needs to be returned. It can be an array, sometimes can be just a string or a number, that depends on the source. Well, in this case, it's a process plugin, as you can see, that supports configuration, because this configuration, we're calling this and asking for, okay, so what type of Spotify info do we need? We build a query, execute the query, and then get from the result, get the exact property that we need to be inserted in our database. I'm skipping over this pretty quickly because this is where the query is built and this is where the query is processed, but trust me, it works. You can actually do this. But this is where it all comes together, and this is where what I wanted to show you guys. So here we are using the Spotify info. So this is our configuration for the processor. So as you can see, we're using our Spotify info processor twice. First time we used type album. Oh wait, yeah, we twice used this type album. First time we get the property release date from the return value from the API, and a second time we're using external URLs Spotify property. So this is how you can write a more generic processing plugin that contains some logic, contains it only once, and then adapts to the configuration that you put in your YAML files. And as you can also see, for the source, I'm putting in two things. So in this case, when you go up here, in the transform, the value would in this case be an array which contains two things: the artist name and the title. So in that way you can provide all the data that your processor needs to do its magic. Are there any questions so far about the processing and stuff? Yeah? Sorry?
No, it's a couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes. Oh, really?
11 o'clock finish.
Yes, so that's a couple more minutes.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so a migration never comes alone, right? I mean, if everything was perfect, there wouldn't be a migration. So when you're dealing with your clients, be sure to listen what they're saying and be sure to understand what it really means that they're saying. Because if they say they want to decide, it probably means new URLs, which means redirect. If you get it wrong, your Google rating will drop automatically, and there's recovery from it, but there's no undo button once your Google ranking has dropped. If they see a new design, it might mean that now they suddenly want a new image on an image on every node, while that wasn't available in the source database. So think about that. When they say new navigation, probably they might mean revised categories or other structural things. When they say new workflow, that might mean that you're going to need new different input filters. So these are just a couple of examples, but try when you're starting this, try to understand your client goals and think through what it means for your migration. Because in the end, they still will expect that the existing content will magically fit into this new system. So yeah, that's where you have to manage expectations. One thing we have learned sometimes the hard way is that complexity equals change squared. With that I mean, if your migration is dependent on lots of changes being made, it will get more complex really quickly. So try to reduce the number of changes introduced with the migration. And if you think about what I just showed you, it's a nice example of a processing plugin, but in fact, this Spotify process plugin is a really bad idea. Yeah, it has no place in your migration really. This can be done beforehand or afterwards. If you can keep stuff like that out of your migration, do it. So here's a must: start early. If you have a project and you say, okay, we've got 4 sprints, we'll do the migration in sprint 4. Nah. Migrate early and keep importing. Estimate generously and double it. It's going to cost time. Just can't make it better than that. It just will. So I had a couple of tips and tricks, but maybe first we should get to questions, if there are questions. Okay, so then we'll go on. Save time. You're going to perform your migrations a lot, just to test them and test them and test them again. So you want to save some time, and there are 2 ways to do it. First, disable search indexing, because all those nodes that are created, you don't need them to be indexed. So disable that, and it will run a bit quicker. Also, run your migration with Drush when you can, because it's a bit faster than running them from the UI. On the other hand, the UI does have the advantage that you can easily have this debugger in your browser, and then you can put a breakpoint in PHP Storm, which in some cases is a bit difficult with Drush and VMs and Docker containers and stuff. Another way to save time is to have a reduced data set. I used this when I was importing thousands of articles. I put this setting in my settings local PHP, so had a reduce factor, and then if I have a reduce factor, I'm adding this to my query. So what it does is it only takes every 100th item out of the database and processes it, and the rest is then ignored. So why did I do it like this? Well, this was a database that had articles from the past 60 years. So I could put a limit on it and say, just give me the first 200 things. In that case, they would all have been from 1958 and 1959, which is probably not a representative selection of the whole database. If you do it like this, you get things spread out across the whole database, so you have a more representative selection of data from your database. Another tip, when you're processing your migration and then you've got a staging database, a staging side, where your client is probably making manual edits, and then finally you find out that one thing wasn't imported correctly and you need to run it again. Then you got a problem, because if you run the whole migration again, you're throwing away these manual edits that the editors made, and they're not going to be happy. Well, fortunately, in the destination part of your migration config, you can add this override properties key, and this will tell Drupal to only override the fields that are whitelisted here. So in this case, if you add this, and must admit I just did it on the server once, not even in Git or whatever, just added it on the server, made sure we could run the category import, the category field again, and the rest was ignored. One more tip, there's a shortcut called entity generate, which is a really easy, quick way to create term entities, for instance. So you don't need to create completely separate migration for your terms before you can get to the nodes. This will just create your terms on the fly while you are creating your node entities. It is really quick, but it has a downside. There's no rollbacks, no mappings, no nothing. But sometimes tags don't even have a source ID in your database, so there would be no mapping anyway. In that case, this is a great way to just get it over with and import those tags or categories. Cool. So that's for the tips. Someone last lady told me that we see the slogan. Well, we don't see the slogan enough. So here it is: come for the software, stay for the community. And before we get to any questions, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank the sponsors that have made it possible for us to be here and be here in this room and have drinks yesterday evening, stuff like that. Thank you to the Drupal community. Thanks to organizers and volunteers. Thank you. Thank my employer, Lieven Groen, for bringing me here. Okay, so maybe we've got time for a couple of questions, and if not, you can find me on Twitter or email. Don't be shy. Cool. I'm glad it was so clear. Okay, so thanks, and see you around.
Coffee break.
Coffee break, yeah.
Coffee break and then another session here.
Yeah.
We'll do it.